This is Duke University.
This week on Office Hours, Professors Eric and Carol Myers have been working on archaeological digs in Israel for more than 3 decades. They have unearthed artifacts from the Bronze Age to the time of Jesus, occasionally weighing in on controversy surrounding the history of the Bible. They take your questions on the charged combination of biblical archaeology, politics, and the media.
I'm James Todd with Duke's News Office, and I am here with Professor Carol Myers, who is the Mary Grace Wilson Professor of Religion here at Duke and also Director of Undergraduate Studies in the Department of Religion. And also with us is Professor Eric Myers. He is the Bernice and Morton Lerner Professor of Judaic Studies here at Duke and also the Director of Duke's Center for Jewish Studies. We're here to talk about archaeology in the Holy Land. So you all were back in Israel this summer working on a dig near the Sea of Galilee. Professor Carol Myers, can you take us to the site? What are you doing? What are you looking for?
Well, we're actually looking for whatever's there. I mean, it's very hard to explain that don't have some particular treasure or artifact in mind, but we're really interested in the whole cultural history of a site, and so virtually anything that we uncover is important data. Everything we uncover may not be of equal interest to the general public, but it's an important part of our research agenda. But our excavations over the decades that we've been doing them are also about engaging students. And we get students there, they find out that they can get up at 4:30 in the morning.
Did you have students with you this summer?
We did have students with us this summer. Being with them 24/7 is a fantastic experience for us as well as for them. We get to interact with students and they get to interact with us in a way that would never happen in a classroom on campus. And they learn about how we reconstruct the past. For many students, history is just what they read in a history book. And this way they get to see how little bits and pieces come together, are integrated with other bits and pieces from other places, and together we begin to construct some idea of what the site was like and about its place in the history of the ancient world.
And Professor Eric Myers, could you speak to this site, the ancient city of Sepphoris? Why is it an important site in the biblical history or otherwise?
It has become a very popular site in scholarly literature and in popular literature, and primarily because it was the capital of Galilee in the time of Jesus. But I add immediately that it's not mentioned in the New Testament, and the fact that it's not mentioned in the New Testament has led to all sorts of interpretive turns by scholars. And it's very close to Nazareth, we might add. It's, as the crow flies, 3 or 4 kilometers, and by an ancient pathway, probably 45 minutes. So I think the site has become well known as a site related to the life of Jesus and the New Testament. For Jewish history, it is one of the major administrative districts after the Roman conquest of Palestine in 63, before the Common Era. So from 63 BCE right up through the Middle Ages, it's a very significant site, and circa 200 CE, it is the home of Rabbi Judah the Patriarch, the head of the Jewish community in the land of Israel, the land of the Bible, where the Mishnah is published and edited along with some of the other famous writings.
And the Mishnah is?
The Mishnah is kind of a commentary on the Bible. It has law codes and homiletical expansions on all sorts of things. A magnificent document created in the first centuries CE.
And so when you're at a site, you have this history in your head. Can you talk about that interaction between what you know from reading and what you're seeing in front of you at the dig, Professor Carol Myers?
Well, obviously, the first thing that we want to know is what these objects are and how they were used. And that's really a question that's quite apart from the political or religious history of the site. We have actually broader interests in culture history. Are the way artifacts were used then the same as the similar ones would be today? What is the change in the kind of artifacts that are used? What does change in technology tell us about larger developments in certain sorts of food processing activities or in glass making and so on. So we engage in a wider discourse than just the kind of reconstruction of religious and political history that Eric was mentioning just a few minutes ago.
However, I just like to add that
I was gonna ask
knowing
you
the
to add that.
historical framework in which these cultural changes are made makes it more engaging and makes it more interesting, rather than a prehistorian doesn't have the benefit of literary records and history in the sense that we have to place technology and material culture. So working within the framework of classical civilization, the Greco-Roman period, we're very blessed to have the challenge of interpreting artifacts in the light of the materials that are known through preserved literary documents.
We've had a question that's come in along those lines, and everyone watching is invited to ask Professors Eric and Carol Myers a question. You can do that by email, by Facebook, or by Twitter. This question's come in by email from David, and he asks, in your work in the Galilee, have you ever come across springs where Jews or early Christians built worship centers? That is, they considered the spring to be holy or sacred for some reason.
There are springs near sacred sites, but I think neither in a Jewish context or Christian context in the Holy Land that I know of were the springs made to be holy sites. Water is very significant and important for both ancient Jews and Christians. Ritual purity, bathing in water for Jews was part and parcel of the emergence of the Jewish faith. And we have ritual baths, mikvaot, in most synagogue settings, either in them, underneath them, adjacent to them, and they have to be fed by rainwater or spring water. I don't know of a single one that I could identify as being adjacent to a spring. And of course, in the Christian tradition and churches, you have a baptistry and you need access to water. And the bottom line is, you're not going to have a church or synagogue or community with them without fresh water available, because that's the real stuff of human life.
I'll add something
Please.
to that, too, that there are not a lot of springs, at least in the East Mediterranean area in which we've been working. And so springs are places in which people would have settled in any case. So the proximity of a house of worship to a spring is a matter of the pragmatics of having a water source available for living, not only for religious purposes.
Great. We've got another question that's come in, and this one from Dean in New Zealand, who says there have been a few media reports in recent months concerning the ongoing excavation at Tel Safi. The reports often make representations along the lines that archaeologists are, quote, excavating the biblical city of Gath, that is, quote, discovering Goliath's hometown. He references in the Bible 1 Samuel 17. So his question is that right? Is this Goliath's hometown? On what basis might somebody be making that claim?
The claim that that's his hometown is related to the old problem of historical geography. That is, how do you link a site that's mentioned in the Old Testament or the New Testament with the sticks and stones and rocks on the ground? And sometimes it's very easy because the modern name will bear some kind of resemblance to the ancient name. In the case of Tel Safi, that's not the case. And so I don't know that it will ever be actually completely identified as such unless there is an inscription discovered at the site itself that happens to mention the name of the site, and that's highly unlikely. But there's an ancillary issue there has to do with whether Goliath was a historical person or whether he's a legendary character. And that's, again, something that I don't think archaeology can answer. Having said that, however, there was an inscription found not too long ago that seems to mention in the Philistine language a name that seems to be similar to the name Goliath. But all that would tell us is that it would be like today if somebody found an inscription with James on it. Well, it could be James, or it could be another James or another James. It wouldn't authenticate, if that in fact is the name Goliath on the inscription, it wouldn't authenticate the historical reality of the biblical character by that name.
Great. We've had another question that's come in along these same lines. Joe from Jerusalem writes, the profession, archaeology, is seeing more and more professors et al. Posing as biblical archaeologists for the media, whereas they have no degree nor field experience to justify such fraud. What should be the university's position on this? Censure, reprimand, firing, or any ideas? So if there is too much being claimed about a site, are you all seeing that, and what's the proper response?
Every field of research has people who want to step into the void and fill in the missing pieces, so to speak. Biblical archaeology is such a field that attracts a lot of people to it who are not trained as archaeologists. And
Why?
Why?
Yeah.
First of all, to be a seasoned archaeologist, you have to go into the field and get dirty. Mm-hmm. And that takes more than a classroom experience. That takes going over, being in the field, learning pottery, learning how to dig carefully, how to record in a notebook or today in a computer. And many of the people who have emerged as experts before the media have never really had that kind of background. And of course, there's learning in books, and we've each trained many, many students in the field and in the library, so to speak, here on campus in the middle of North Carolina, while we have to take them to the field in Israel or other parts of the Eastern Mediterranean to learn archaeology. So biblical archaeology attracts a lot of people who want to answer these questions and have no real preparation or background in that. And I think this gentleman from Jerusalem knows a lot of those people. We know them, but since they make the press and often get quoted, I think it's hard for the layperson to identify who's for real and who's not for real. I could use stronger language, but I won't.
And you all had a conference around this, archaeology, politics, and the media here at Duke a couple years ago. So what are some of the responses? In fact, and you all have been interviewed in some of these articles, point, counterpoint, about an artifact's authenticity.
Well, I would say that there's no clear way for us to proceed to try to deal with the way in which sensationalist claims are made in the media. That we don't make them ourselves, but it's hard to counteract the tendency of people here and there who enjoy the spotlight and or claim that they have inside biblical information to make those claims in the media. The media seems to love that kind of splash, and there's a kind of frustration on the part of many scholars about the fact that their own solid work gets overlooked in the process of the attention that's given to these kinds of claims.
I would cite the case of the James ossuary
And so,
as being the prime example of how an artifact with the name James on it.
an ossuary is...
An ossuary is a small box for the reburial of the bones of the dead.
Okay.
And the James in question, of course, in Aramaic script and Aramaic name, it's more like Jacob than like James. But anyway, it was identified as the oldest Christian artifact ever to be discovered. And I was at the original press conference where that statement was made. And of course, it turns out that the ossuary had been in a private collection, had been around for 20 years, and had a very checkered history of acquisition and was unprovenanced, even though we knew it was probably from Jerusalem.
And this is James, brother of Jesus. That's
This
the
is
Christian
James, the
connection.
brother of Jesus, yes. And the debate over the interpretation of the inscription to this day is going on. There's a case about whether its status under Israeli law that's still before the courts and unresolved. And while I think a number of people now think that the whole inscription is genuine, the fact that it is unprovenance, we don't know where it came from, though certain popularizers have told us that the Israel Antiquities Authority got it mixed up and it really came from a tomb. Now there's a film coming out that says it probably came from a tomb that belonged to the first generation of the followers of Jesus, and it fits right in. And that's the kind of sensationalism and jumping on names and identifying these names with historical personages in the Bible, in this case the New Testament, that really, I think, goes beyond the evidence.
And what's your skepticism about that in particular?
The James
James
Ossuary?
Ossuary.
Well, the gentleman who owns it and who's being tried in Jerusalem for forgery and was featured on a CBS special about being a forger, and he was caught in his lab with all sorts of dirt samples and proving that patent could be faked and or understood to be that sort of thing. It's just a big mess, and it has confused museum experts. It has put the Israel Museum and the Antiquities Authority in Israel under charges of, I think, most of them false. And there is nothing more dirty in archaeology than the antiquities market. This is a field that brings in millions, if hundreds of millions, perhaps billions of dollars a year. It's like being controlled by a mafia group. It's an underworld that is just destroying the integrity of the discipline.
We've had a question come in along the lines of sensationalism, and everybody watching is invited to join this conversation. You can ask Professor Eric and Carol Myers a question by email, by Facebook, or by Twitter. So this question has come in from Jim, and he says, I'm wondering why you think it is that the sort of pseudo-archaeology made popular on shows on the Discovery Channel seems to capture the public's attention to the extent that false information eclipses accurate and responsible scholarship.
Well, I don't think there's one size fits all for answering that question, because pseudo-archaeology ranges widely. It can involve the kinds of issues with respect to the James Ossuary that we were just talking about. It can have to do with, like, the lost city of Atlantis really existed, or one of the things that I'm interested in some of my other work, feminist issues, the claims that there was a prehistoric original goddess movement in which everybody was peaceful and people got along with each other, and then male warriors came along and destroyed all that, and now we have violence and war and contention.
And you're skeptical?
Well, I've looked at the so-called archaeological evidence for this, and it's certainly not straightforward and can be interpreted in many other ways, and I think it's being incorrectly interpreted. Yet feminists who want to say, well, that if they really left the world to women and had a primeval matriarchy with goddess worship reinstated, that we'd all be better off for it. So that's one of the reasons for that kind of pseudo-archaeology to be so popular. But as I said, every particular claim has to be investigated on its own terms. With respect to ones that have to do with the Bible, I think it's quite clear. These pseudo-archaeological claims usually are ones that are meant to say the Bible is literally true, to claim that kind of truth for Scripture. There's a kind of religious motivation for them.
And Professor Eric Myers, I mean, you both have been in some of these TV reports or documentaries, the Nova, The Bible's Hidden Secret. You all were interviewed for that. So how do you prepare for these? How do you sort of manage those interviews?
Well, most of these shows run on a very modest budget, and there's not a heck of a lot of preparation on the part of some of them. The Nova show was a wonderful exception to that rule. We had ample conversation with the producer and director, one of whom is a PhD in Hebrew Bible and archaeology, and they are very meticulous about these things, and that was very gratifying. I'd add The Prince of Egypt. We consulted on the movie The Prince of Egypt, which was a lot of fun, but it fed into the sensationalist narrative that Carol has just described. And when we met with the production team in the studio and saw some of the early runs, we objected to a number of things. One, the literalization of the flood and the drowning of the Egyptians, and they were looking for this to appeal to children. We didn't like such a literal view, and it was a fairly gruesome scene. The music was great and all of that, but the film had to be geared to a literal interpretation of the Bible, and they would not budge from that at all, despite the fact that the two of us, and I'm sure many others, objected to that sort of literalism.
One thing I would say to their credit, we spoke at some length. I find it really interesting about who would be the voice of God. Is God male or is God female? Should you have a female voice or a male voice? And actually, they thought that was a legitimate concern. So they tried to have to mix, to have both a male and a female voiceover, and they would kind of mix the male and female, and it sounded really terrible. So they ended up with having the same actor who was the voice of Moses also do the voice of God, kind of giving the impression that Moses was really the one who was hearing God's voice. So that's why it would come out sounding like Moses. They kind of sidestepped the whole issue.
Okay, we've got a tweet that's come in. Tricia Koenig from Cleveland Heights says she's from a DIG alum from way back. Thanks for the memories. So just a shout for
Trish.
Yeah. And JD has emailed in with a question. In your opinions, is there such thing as mainstream archaeology? If so, have you found this community reluctant to publish work that would confirm biblical accounts from antiquity? So kind of overly skeptical among the academic community.
I think the mainstream academic community is very responsible, and as Carol and I have repeatedly said already today, we take the evidence and we interpret it as best we can and present it as fairly and even-handedly as we can. It's the people on the fringes who are not doing that. But we have a wonderful society, the American Schools of Oriental Research. We have a convention in conjunction, in concert with the Society for Biblical Literature. We give papers. There are 1,400 members. I think last year had 600 papers given on biblical and Near Eastern archaeological subjects. And by and large, these are first-rate, wonderful people prosecuting the field and searching for the truth without any hint of bias.
Great. Everyone watching is welcome to participate in this office hours conversation. You can do that by email, by Facebook, or by Twitter. So here's an interpretive challenge that's been emailed in from Zach in Australia. He asks, what do you think is the current state of the debate about David and Solomon and the archaeological evidence for what was happening during their period in Israel? Essentially, did they have a united monarchy, as has been claimed in one camp, but not another?
This is the tip of an iceberg of a very big debate that's been going on for, I guess, decades now in biblical studies and archaeology. And part of the problem is really a semantic one. What do we mean by monarchy? And how do we deal with a biblical text that makes David and Solomon seem like really grand figures, and with a post-biblical tradition that makes them larger than life? There are a number of different ways to think about it. I would say that the idea of the kind of political entity that they represent, that maybe monarchy isn't even in the best term. I no longer doubt the historicity of some sort of political unit in the 10th century BCE based in Jerusalem. But was it the seat of a empire that stretched all over the East Mediterranean, as the biblical narratives would want us to believe? That's hardly unlikely. The material evidence doesn't support that kind of growth and expansion and interconnection. But what they started there had some sort of enduring value. It continued over the centuries afterwards. And there is an inscription that mentions the house of David. It comes from several decades later than David would have ruled, but it mentions a Davidic dynasty, and that can't be cast aside. Some of the people who think that, or would want to think that the United Monarchy or the Davidic line didn't exist, would say that that was a forgery, a fraud. But in this instance, the circumstances of how it was discovered are extremely well known. The archaeologists who found them have great integrity. One of them is deceased now. But there seems to be no doubt that this is the kind of inscriptional evidence that can be used in relationship to archaeological materials and biblical narratives to give credence to some aspect, at least, of the David story in the Hebrew Bible.
I'd like to supplement that and just say that this debate, which in popular literature is known as the maximalist-minimalist debate, has also spawned a whole variety of views that have become very controversial. High chronology people have been accused of being pro-Israeli and anti-Palestinian, and real intellectual challenges and fights have been fought over this. A major reason being that if you take the minimalist posture, a lot of the early history of Israel falls aside. It's not just the United Monarchy, since the question is, when can we speak of an early Israel? And so the flood goes by, there's, the Egyptian sojourn goes, and if you say there's the earliest proof for the existence of an ethnic entity known as the people Israel is late 11th or 10th century, and it couldn't be a monarchy, then you have to deal with a whole bunch of earlier things in biblical history. And I think some of that has caused great confusion in the discipline. And that debate started in the late 1980s. And it has caused a rethinking of the intellectual position of a lot of American scholarship who fall under the umbrella of the Albright School, Johns Hopkins professor par excellence, called the doyen or founder of the biblical archaeology movement in America. William Foxwell Albright was a positivist, but things have changed.
Where do you fall on this?
I both Carol and I would be accused of being maximalists on this. I think not in a literal sense, but we believe that there was an early Israel, a very modest kind of sorts, and that there probably was a group of Israelites who might have sojourned or been in Egypt. But what the Bible does with that spotty information is to weave a magnificent narrative that becomes part of the story of Israelite origins that we needn't take to be literally true, but could well have spawned some of the most important ideas in biblical history.
So in talking about the Kingdom of David and Jerusalem, you told Time magazine last year that Jerusalem is a tinderbox. And of course, we're familiar with some of the political tensions in the Middle East, but what role does archaeology have in that?
This was one of the main themes of our media conference 2 years ago. And the literalists and maximalists who subscribe to a major city of David have abused really international law, gone over the green line that is recognized by the United States to excavate in certain areas and present to the public their results in ways that offend critical scholars like ourselves.
What's offensive? What do you find offensive about the way it's being excavated and presented? I guess there's a
the archaeologists in the main are wonderful archaeologists. They have ceded the informational distribution task to a group that is associated with the settler movement. And the settler movement presents in a tourist visitor center a narrative that is the equivalent of fundamentalism in Christianity. So these are fundamentalist Jews who see the biblical narrative as endorsing the wider Israel movement and annexing the West Bank, the most significant portions of East Jerusalem that have a so-called biblical connection. And this is what we spoke a lot about at our conference, and this is what now has divided Jerusalem along many lines that were not public till recently.
But for our viewers, we've actually tweeted out a link to the conference that you all hosted here 2 years ago on archaeology, politics, and the media. And we had a tweet in here from Jessica, who said that college regret not going on Israel program with Eric and Carol Myers. So
Oh, well.
missed the chance.
Well, I'll say something more about how our classroom and archaeology experiences combine. We, of course, have for decades took students with us. I've already alluded to that at the beginning of the show. But right now, we're following up on some of the things that Eric's just been talking about, the way archaeology has not only been used in the attempts to verify biblical stories, but also now has this political dimension. And we've developed a course, which we've done once and are about to do again beginning this winter, called Holy Land Archaeology, Religious and Political Issues. And we begin the course, which is a seminar at Duke, with a 2-week field trip to Israel and the Palestinian Authority, where we take students into the dirt and they get a grasp of what the issues are in a way that I don't think they ever could in the classroom.
Great. We've been talking about Kingdom of David, Jerusalem. A little bit lighter question here that has come in from Barbara. And excited to be able to pose a question. I am writing an historical novel about David and Bathsheba, and perhaps comically can't help wondering about the precise details of their toileting habits. I didn't live in the period. Your help would be very much appreciated. So toileting habits circa 1000 before the Common Era.
I think the person who's called in or twittered in is referring to the fact that Bathsheba took a bath on the roof. And as you can imagine, in the Middle East in summertime, the roof is a place where you might often want to sleep, wash up, and I doubt whether there was a bathtub up there, but I'm sure many, many women to this day will go up on the roof of a house to wash, and maybe their neighbor could have seen them. There is a biblical law in the book of Deuteronomy that requires a parapet, a banister, a railing for preventative security reasons, and apparently it was too low for Bathsheba.
We've been talking some about when an artifact is found and it's provenance, so it's after it's found, there's the excitement of when it's uncovered, but then who owns it, who has custodianship of it. You all, in your dig at Sepphoris, back maybe 25 years ago now, found this beautiful mosaic tile that got dubbed the Mona Lisa of Galilee. I'm wondering, how did you all handle all those issues about presenting this to the public, about how does it get displayed and who owns it?
Well, everything that's dug up in the state of Israel belongs to the state of Israel. And I think most, maybe not all, but most countries in which there are archaeological expeditions have similar laws. I mean, it's the cultural property of the country in which it exists. Sometimes we can apply for a permit to bring things out of the country for study purposes, but eventually they all go back to the government, and there are huge storerooms in Israel for all the artifacts that are uncovered in all the excavations. That being said, with respect to the particular find, the mosaic, well, obviously that's not something we're bringing back to hang in our offices at Duke, but we had the question about how to preserve it and how to take care of it. And sometimes there's vandalism at sites, so as soon as we uncovered it, which happened to be Murphy's Law on the last day of the dig that season, the Antiquities Authority, not knowing themselves yet what they thought should be done with it to take care of it, they said, well, just cover it back up while we think about how to deal with it. So After spending weeks painstakingly uncovering it, we poured clean dirt and sand back on top of it. And during the winter, they decided that it should be removed to Jerusalem for consolidation and treatment and preservation. It would go on display for a while at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, but ultimately they wanted it back in its original place. That gave us we did have it lifted and taken to Jerusalem. That gave us an opportunity to excavate underneath it and find out its context. And it gave us an opportunity to help plan for a proper building that would be built over it once it was brought back to the site. And it's back there now. The Mona Lisa is in her original place in a wonderful air-conditioned building, and tourists and visitors can have a look at the whole context.
And a Duke family, by the way, parents of one of our students bailed us out of a situation because the antiquities department decided that we had to pay for the restoration. It was not a matter that was 100% clear in our permit, but we found a very generous Duke family to help with this and actually paid the entire bill for the restoration of the mosaic, and it bears their name to this day.
And how did you present it? I mean, there was some media attention. I know there's a New York Times story. Did you say we've just found the? What did you tell them? You didn't say the Mona Lisa.
No, well,
what context did you?
No,
give it?
when we found it, the woman's face is so beautiful, and it also had this characteristic of wherever you stood in relationship to her face, she seemed to be looking at you. Mm-hmm. So the similarity to the famous painting popped in mind, and I think we dubbed it almost immediately.
I don't think we did. I think it was one of the reporters who came.
I just don't remember that. But no, then we explained that this is part of a mosaic floor in a patrician building, a building of a well-to-do family, may have been someone of political or religious importance at the site. And
this happened during the first Intifada, and Carol, it was mainly Carol who was interviewed by NBC, and the story's lead-in was the good stones of Israel.
Good stones of Galilee.
Or Galilee,
yeah.
You all mentioned vandalism of the site and protecting it, and you actually have had sites vandalized. Is this looters, or what's security around a site like?
This is a huge problem in all countries. I'm sure you've read stories about Italy recently, where there's been collapses because not enough money has been put in. But in all countries too, especially the Middle East, looters, vandals, and religious fanatics often do severe damage. We excavated a synagogue in the extreme north of Israel, towards the Lebanese border, with a diverse group of students, men and women, Christians, Jews. I don't think we had any Muslims in those days, but we had a Muslim work team with us from one of the Arab villages around. And we were harassed by religious zealots, Orthodox Jews, who didn't like the way we dressed, especially the ladies who wore short shorts and tank tops, and you know what, in 100-degree weather, you're not going to wear long shirts and the like. And some of the Christian women wore crucifixes. And the site was vandalized and repeatedly. And when the Jewish National Fund, which manages the forest around it, recently built a picnic area and restored it as a place for celebrations, the pictures of us and the signage was destroyed, and it was vandalized, and several reporters in the Israeli press called them the Taliban of Israel. And no sooner was it replaced and repaired, they did it again. And just within the last couple of weeks, I've been in touch with a gentleman who runs the forest in that particular area, an Arab friend, and they're looking at ways to put the signage up so that it could not be defaced. And just in the magazine I got before I walked over here, there's the story of a major Christian church that was found in western Galilee from the 5th century CE, which is built over the reputed tomb of Zechariah. the prophet who lived 1,000 years before that. But they decided to leave the gorgeous mosaics exposed so that visitors could see it, but they didn't have guards at night. And just a few weeks ago, the site was vandalized, and the inspector of antiquities in the area said it looked like it was bombed.
Wow.
And it was just awfully ruined.
That's too bad.
Yep.
We've been talking about various media reports. There's one that was quite fun, the People magazine article back when
Back in the day.
Yes, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Some of us remember the excitement there with Harrison Ford and Karen Allen. And People magazine did a story on you all because you actually were working on an excavation and found an ark,
Right.
not the Ark of the Covenant, and had some fun with that. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that story, but also it points out you all are colleagues. You're also married. You've raised children in addition to teaching and traveling to Israel and doing these digs. And I think people are always curious, what's it like to be a professor, not just in the library and at conferences, but your kind of whole life.
I'd like to start off with a story about my mentor at Harvard, Ernest Wright, of blessed memory. He told me when I was asked to start a new expedition in the Galilee and organize a team, he says, Eric, I want this to be a family operation. He says, I've seen in my own work at Shechem and at Tel Gezer, where we also worked, that a lot of families got broken up. I mean, young men, when they go off in the wilds of a new territory, and all these young women are bound to get in trouble. He says, and I want you to bring your kids, and I want you to bring your wife, who will ultimately have a leadership role in this. She was a few years behind me. And our eldest daughter, Julie, who is an infant at the time, was given a Harvard University travel scholarship so that the three of us could be together during my first season as a director of a major expedition. And we're very proud of the fact that, especially in those early years when our kids were small, the kids always came. And we had a whole area of the dig camp where the kids would play and stay.
It was perpetual sandbox. I mean, it was fun for kids, and they also had for our children, and they also had all the students who were with us eager to play with them. So it was a very engaging opportunity, an educational opportunity, and all kinds of social as well as knowledge ways for the kids over the years.
But you never faced a rolling boulder or a pit of fire or any that wasn't no, okay.
No, we didn't come across that.
No, but vandals. I mean, vandalism, looting is a major issue in archaeology, especially people from the lower strata of society. They think they can find things and sell on the open market, in the antiquities market.
Yeah. Well, there's a kind of crossover here, or interaction between vandalism, where they just are out to deface something intentionally, and poaching, or looking for objects in which they break other things in the process. And I think that the experiences that we had at the site that Eric mentioned a while ago was purely vandalism, intentionally defacing something. I don't know that we've ever had the experience of things being disrupted while they were looking for something that these people could sell on the antiquities market.
When we were excavating a tomb, and the religious zealots were after us, we sent that team out in the middle of the night so as to avoid detection, and we excavated one of the last major tomb complexes in the Galilee. Gave all of the human remains to the Hebrew University, to a very distinguished professor, and that skeletal group has proved to be one of the most important pieces of evidence in reconstructing the nature of life in the Galilee in the Roman period in Palestine, but is now forbidden to do that.
We've got a couple more questions here, everyone watching. can ask Professor Carol Eric Myers a question by email, by Facebook, or by Twitter. We're coming up on the hour, but I just want to get in
Okay.
at least one more here. We've got a tweet in from Lucille Johnson. Hello, Eric and Carol. I'm loving the broadcast. So
Okay.
she says hello. Here's a kind of a lighter question that's come in from Nicole and Amir. Apparently, a couple. They found this picture on the internet from biblicalarchaeology.org, and they want to know, was it taken at the Berea Synagogue in the Berea Forest?
Yes, yes.
Were you involved with that? My wife and I have a home near there. Would love to have you over for a glass of wine and talk archaeology.
Oh,
So-
that's great.
This is precisely the site where the vandalism occurred, and that's a picture that we took with our picture cemented in stone there, but it has been vandalized several times since, and we're in conversation with the Jewish National Fund, the JNF, in Berea Forest to protect it in a better way. And we've even volunteered to help raise some money for the project.
Here's the picture. So as we start to wrap up here, you all have had a decades-long career. If there's a student considering archaeology, especially archaeology in the Holy Land, you've talked about some of the pitfalls and tensions. There's obviously a lot of romance around it. We mentioned Raiders of the Lost Ark. What would your advice be for someone trying to navigate this field, a undergrad student, a graduate student?
Well, I would encourage, if they have a passion for it, I would certainly encourage them, as I would if they had a passion for English literature or chemistry. I think that's the most important thing for enjoying and having success in whatever career path a student has. And I would also tell them what some of the challenges are that they might face along the way, but I would mainly encourage them to follow their hearts.
I couldn't agree more, but I would urge them, while studying archaeology, to be sure to study it in such a way that they're going to have teaching skills beyond simple archaeology, like biblical history, ancient Near Eastern history, languages, so that archaeology is set within the larger cultural framework that is the ancient Near East.
Great. Well, before we wrap up, I want to mention some things that people can look forward to. You both are working on an edited volume, Archaeology, Bible, Politics, and the Media. That's in press. Professor Eric Myers, you're working with your colleague Mark Chancey on a forthcoming book, Archaeology of the Land of the Bible, from Alexander to Constantine. And could you tell us about a conference that you all have coming up next fall?
Sure.
We hope to have another conference in fall before the election on the Bible and its place in the public square. And as you certainly know, and you can't help but avoid the subject, a number of candidates for political office, a number of religious leaders are pushing creationism in the public sector, a literal reading of the Bible. Kentucky has these new museums, and there are others in the works. And we want to expose our students and the larger public to what the stakes are in this discussion.
Great. Well, Professor Eric Myers, Professor Carol Myers, thank you for holding these online office hours.
Our pleasure.
Been fun.
Everybody watching is invited to tune in next week when Bruce Cunnahome, Dean of the Sanford School of Public Policy here at Duke, and his son Jonathan discuss veterans since 9/11. You can send your questions in now by email, by Facebook, or by Twitter. A recording of this conversation will be available on the Duke On Demand website. That's ondemand.duke.edu.